Architecture is the art and technique of designing and building. It involves creating plans and constructing buildings or structures. Architecture has been practiced by civilizations all over the world and is considered a form of art. The earliest known text on architectural theories was written by the Roman architect Vitruvius. Throughout history, different architectural styles and techniques have emerged, influenced by various cultures. Modern architecture developed after World War I, focusing on meeting the needs of the middle and working classes. Architects have also expanded their field to include other types of design, such as ship design and interior decorating. Architecture can refer to buildings and other physical structures. It involves designing and constructing these structures using art, science, technology, and humanity. Architects are the people who design buildings, from the bigger picture of cities and landscapes to the smaller details like furniture. The philosophy of architecture is the study of the artistic value of buildings and how they relate to culture. Many philosophers and thinkers have debated whether architecture is different from simply building something. Architecture is the art of creating buildings that are strong, useful, and beautiful. It has been studied and written about for thousands of years. One of the earliest known works on architecture was written by a Roman architect named Vitruvius. He said that a good building should be sturdy, practical, and pleasing to the eye. Another famous architect, Leon Battista Alberti, believed that proportion was the most important aspect of beauty in architecture. In the 16th century, Sebastiano Serlio wrote a book that focused on the practical aspects of architecture and cataloged different styles. In the 19th century, architects like Augustus Pugin and John Ruskin had different views on what architecture should be. Pugin believed that Gothic architecture was the true form, while Ruskin thought that aesthetics were the most important. A more modern architect, Le Corbusier, said that architecture is not just construction, but something that touches people's hearts and brings them joy. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe also emphasized the importance of careful craftsmanship in creating architecture. The architect Louis Sullivan believed that buildings should be designed to serve their purpose effectively. This idea was well received, but also met with skepticism. Sullivan's concept of function included not only practical elements, but also how the building is perceived and enjoyed. Architecture can also have a positive impact on society, but it should not focus solely on being perfect or unique for the sake of art. Modern architects are influenced by different philosophical approaches, such as rationalism and empiricism. In addition, sustainable architecture has become an important consideration in recent years. Buildings should be constructed in an environmentally friendly way, considering their impact on the surrounding area and their energy usage. In the past, people needed buildings for different reasons, like shelter and worship. They used materials that were available to them and relied on their skills to build. Over time, as cultures developed, people started to learn and pass down their building knowledge through stories and practices. This started the craft of building, and the most respected and formalized version of this craft is called architecture. People tried different methods and learned from their mistakes to make better buildings. Today, in different parts of the world, people still build in their own traditional styles, which is called vernacular architecture. In ancient times, people used to live in small villages and farms, but as they started trading and growing crops, some areas turned into big cities. For example, there was a city called Çatalhöyük in Turkey and another one called Mohenjo-Daro in Pakistan. People also built other important settlements like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Jericho in the Levant, and Skara Brae in Scotland. These places show us how people lived a long time ago. Ancient civilizations like Egypt and Mesopotamia used big and impressive buildings to show their connection with gods and to show off their power. The Greeks and Romans had a different approach to architecture and made buildings that represented their cities and civic values. Greek architecture influenced Roman architecture. People have been writing about architecture for a long time, giving advice and rules for how buildings should look. Some of the oldest examples of these rules are about religious buildings. Asian architecture developed differently than European architecture. There were different types of architecture in Asia, such as Buddhist, Hindu, and Sikh architecture, each with their own unique characteristics. Indian and Chinese architecture had a big influence on the surrounding regions, but Japanese architecture did not have as much influence. Buddhist architecture, in particular, showed a lot of regional diversity. Hindu temple architecture developed from the 5th century and was based on concepts from the Shastras, which are important texts. In many Asian countries, the architecture was designed to enhance the natural landscape. Traditional Asian houses were often made of wood and were lightweight. Buddhism led to the use of stone and brick for religious structures. There are ancient writings on architecture, such as the Cao Gong Ji from China and the Shilpa Shastras from India. Islamic architecture started in the 7th century and took ideas from older buildings in the Middle East and Byzantium. It also created new designs that were important to the beliefs and customs of the people. You can see examples of Islamic architecture in many countries like the Middle East, Turkey, North Africa, India, and even parts of Europe like Spain and the Balkan states. This happened because of the Ottomans growing their empire. During the Middle Ages in Europe, craftsmen formed guilds to organize their trades. They made written contracts to build churches and other important buildings. Architects during this time were usually also master masons. The biggest construction projects were abbeys and cathedrals. From about 900 onwards, architects and builders traveled across Europe, spreading architectural knowledge. This led to the development of two major styles called Romanesque and Gothic. Another important part of European medieval architecture was fortifications. These buildings can be found all across Europe and represent an important part of our heritage. In Renaissance Europe, there was a period of time called the Renaissance, where people became interested in learning about ancient Greek and Roman culture. They believed in the importance of each individual in society. During this time, specific architects were credited for designing buildings, and there was a focus on the talents and abilities of individuals. There wasn't a clear separation between different professions like artists, architects, and engineers. The classical style of architecture became popular again, and advancements in science and engineering influenced how buildings were designed. Artists were even able to design bridges because the calculations needed were not too complicated. During the early modern and industrial age, there were many changes happening in the field of architecture. Architects started focusing more on making buildings look pretty and pleasing to people, instead of just focusing on the technical aspects of building design. Wealthy clients started hiring architects who were known for creating beautiful buildings based on historical styles. In the 19th century, formal architectural training in places like France focused more on creating beautiful drawings rather than considering the practicality of the designs. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution made it possible for things to be mass-produced and consumed by many people. This meant that even middle-class people could have decorative items that used to be expensive to make. Because of this, architects started adding more ornaments and decorations to their designs. They would take inspiration from pattern books and architectural journals to create their buildings. Modernism in architecture began in the early 20th century. People were unhappy with old-fashioned buildings that had lots of decorations and wanted something new. The Deutscher Werkbund was formed to make better quality objects using machines. This led to the Bauhaus school, which changed the way people thought about architecture. Modern architects wanted to create a new style for the post-war world that focused on the needs of ordinary people. They made buildings that were simple and functional without decorations. They showed the structural elements, like steel beams and concrete surfaces, instead of hiding them. Architects like Frank Lloyd Wright designed buildings that blended in with the natural environment. Other architects used new construction techniques and materials to make tall buildings. The Twin Towers in New York City were an example of this new style. After World War II, some architects didn't like the modern style of buildings because they thought it was plain and didn't have the fancy decorations of old buildings. Some younger architects tried to make modern buildings more interesting by using rough, unfinished concrete to create sculptures on the outside. However, another group of architects thought that modern buildings were too boring and not as rich as historical buildings from different times and places. To make buildings more interesting, some architects started using nature as their inspiration. They created buildings that looked like animals or had shapes like plants. This was called metaphoric architecture. In the late 1950s and 1960s, a movement called architectural phenomenology became popular. Architects wanted to create buildings that would give people a special experience, using historical buildings as examples. This movement helped to expand the idea of what architecture could be. Postmodernism was a style that developed, combining new building technology and cheap materials with the look of older, classical buildings or buildings from specific regions. One famous architect, Robert Venturi, described postmodern architecture as a decorated shed, a building that was functional on the inside but had fancy decorations on the outside. He thought this was better than the expressive and exaggerated forms of modernist and brutalist buildings. In recent years, architecture has become more complex and involves many different skills and specialists. There are architects who focus on designing the building and architects who make sure it meets all the necessary standards and laws. The process of designing a large building now involves studying things like durability, sustainability, quality, and cost. It's no longer just one person's work, but a team effort. Some architects believe that successful architecture should focus on the everyday needs of people and use technology to create livable environments. They think the design process should consider studies of how people behave, how the environment affects them, and how society works. Being environmentally friendly has become very important in architecture. Developers and financiers now prefer buildings that are sustainable and use greener materials. There has been a focus on designing buildings that save energy and are better for the environment. Architecture schools have also started teaching more about sustainable design. There have been movements in architecture that promote sustainable construction and appreciate traditional and classical designs. These movements oppose modern and uniform architecture and prioritize smart growth and avoiding suburban sprawl. Different types of architecture include residential architecture, commercial architecture, industrial architecture, landscape architecture, interior architecture, and urban design. Residential architecture is the design of houses and buildings that are functional and follow building codes and laws. Commercial architecture is the design of buildings for businesses, the government, and religious institutions. Industrial architecture is the design of specialized buildings for factories and other industrial purposes, focusing on safety and efficiency. Landscape architecture is the design of outdoor spaces, landmarks, and structures to achieve environmental, social, and aesthetic goals. Interior architecture is the design of spaces within buildings, considering both structural boundaries and how people use the space. Urban design is the process of designing and shaping the physical features of cities, towns, and villages, including buildings, streets, and public spaces, with the goal of creating functional and attractive urban areas. Naval architecture is a type of engineering that focuses on designing, building, and maintaining ships and other marine structures. It involves research, design, calculations, and certifications to ensure that ships are safe and meet all the necessary requirements. There are also other types of architecture that use the term metaphorically. This includes computer architecture, which describes the structure and organization of computer systems, and business architecture, which provides a blueprint for organizations to align their objectives. Another type is cognitive architecture, which studies the structure of the human mind, and system architecture, which defines the structure and behavior of any type of system. Lastly, there is seismic architecture, which focuses on designing buildings that can withstand earthquakes. It can involve different approaches, from using earthquake-resistant technology to incorporating seismic considerations into the architectural design.